again, this is what a lot of people, this is why a lot of people don't do much with history today. And yet, once you dive into it, you find it to be just really exciting and beautiful stuff. And I remember when I was in seminary, when I first started seeing this, and again, I so appreciate the professor I had, Dr. Nathan Feldmuth. Do not hold Dr. Feldmuth accountable for me. I think he'd remember me as a good student. I got good grades in his course. But he certainly installed in me a great love for church history that was only broadened and deepened by my time in Germany a few weeks ago. He had been over there himself, and that really helped in the class. And I would imagine that in the future, some of my church history classes will improve. I always need to be improving. Anyone who ever gets to the point where you don't have to improve anymore, you've known it all. Well, but one of the things that really excited me when I first started studying church history, and especially when Dr. Feldmuth presented the Reformation, was seeing the threads of development that had to come together to allow the Reformation to take place. And so we've seen the pre-Reformation reformers, but I kept saying it wasn't time. It wasn't time. There were certain things that were not in place yet. And what's exciting is when you realize we can look back and see how necessary these things were. The people at the time couldn't see it. For example, the fall of Constantinople. Got a whole book on the subject of the fall of Constantinople on my iPad, on my Kindle. I'm sorry. And at the time, it was a dark day. 1453. The Ottoman Turks finally break through the walls of Constantinople. Of course, the people saw it coming, and so this had led to a tremendous exodus of Greek scholars coming westward. And they brought their manuscripts and their learning with them. And that was extremely important for the Renaissance and for the Reformation. But at the time, it just looked 100% bad. And Constantinople had been weakened by the foolishness of the West. One of the Crusades had sacked Constantinople because of politics. Just foolish, stupid politics. And yet, in God's providence, right at the same time the invention of printing, you have the fall of Constantinople and these manuscripts coming into the West. You know what happens with Johann Gutenberg developing the concept of movable type, at least in the West, which allowed the setting and printing of entire books cheaply and quickly in comparison to the old style of hand copying. It is interesting. I didn't go through the Gutenberg Museum. I wish I had. Well, no, I'm not. Don't get me wrong. I did something more important, I think, but I didn't get to go through it. Everybody else did. But I understand that he used mirrors to do the setting initially, because as you think about it, you have to do it backwards for it to print properly. So if you use a mirror, then you can do it sort of forwards, I guess. In 1455, the Bible was printed at Mainz. It was 1,282 pages long. Till then, the process was a highly guarded secret, but Mainz was sacked in 1456, resulting in a spread of the technology all over Europe. So we're gonna keep this a secret so people can't figure out how we're doing this. And then your city and your print shop gets sacked, and everybody goes, "Oh, look at that! Let's spread this around." Yeah, certainly, certain people called it Gutenberg's folly. In the same way that people looked at radio and then television and then the internet, information technology, transfer of information. Certainly, the church viewed the whole idea as extremely questionable, extremely dangerous. They saw it more in a negative way than a positive way. We like to try to view these things as, well, this is an awesome way to communicate God's truth and look at what good has been done, so on and so forth. But any technological advance in the information area can be used for good and evil. That's That's the nature of the world we live in. But there would have been no Reformation without printing. Luther, as I've mentioned to you, as I assume I've mentioned to you, please forgive me if I repeat things, but not only am I mentioning stuff at PRBC sort of ahead of time, but I lectured on the bus for hours over in Germany. So where did I say it last? I don't know. I've been doing presentations. I'm going to be doing presentations this weekend. And so sometimes I'll repeat things. I apologize. But for at least 2 centuries, Luther held the record for the most number of imprints of printed books in Germany, even long after his death. And there are certain things we possess today, certain books we possess from Luther today, that even modern scholarship does not know where they were printed. The secrecy was so good that even in the modern context, we're like, don't know. So he kept printers really, really busy. And I noticed that a number of the little comments and letters from Luther had to do with typesetting of books and things like that. He was very much involved in how that was laid out. Then, of course, we have the the Renaissance. This particular period of time right before the Reformation was truly exceptional. Listen to these numbers. In the year 1500, Leonardo da Vinci was 45. Christopher Columbus, 45. Machiavelli, 31. Copernicus, 27. Erasmus, 33. Michelangelo, 25. Raphael, 17. Luther, 17. Zwingli, 17. And John Calvin would be born in 1509. Think of that group of individuals and ask yourself a question. Has there ever been a time like that? You think of Da Vinci's genius, and you think of Michelangelo, Raphael, their incredible artistic skills and abilities. It was an amazing time. 1492, you've got Columbus, who knew the world was round and thought going that direction would be shorter than going the other direction. It wasn't. Runs into America in the process, and huge expansion of understanding of the globe at that particular point in time. Nationalism was on the rise, very, very important. You would not have had the response to the indulgence trade if nationalism had not been on the rise, and Germans were thinking of themselves more as Germans than they were members of the Holy Roman Empire. There was a shift in economic distribution, as I said. Middle class had formed, and the middle class had formed under a number of influences, obviously. You can never just limit it to just one or two. But I mentioned one earlier, that was the Black Death. But there is another influence called the Crusades. You had entire huge armies. You had rich men raising armies of other men that were wealthy enough to go off on a multi-year crusade. And often they didn't come back. And so while the wealth had been concentrated in their hands, if they don't come back, then it becomes distributed more. And you end up with, between that and the Black Death, you end up with the middle class. Interesting how that happened. Banking had developed in Italy in the 1300s. Now corporations were being formed as well. This led to a need for education. And so more schools are coming into existence. And so you're coming out of that feudal time period, and people are starting to travel again. And that's why in the Renaissance you have that phrase ad fontes. And in fact, when you hear about Renaissance humanism, the great cry of the Renaissance humanists was ad fontes, to the source. to the source. It wasn't modern day humanism in the sense of viewing the world from a secular perspective, but it did elevate man's capacity to actually directly interact with God's world and have true knowledge of it, rather than only mediated through the schoolmen or scholasticism or whatever else. So humanism at that time emphasized study, scholarship, reading of the original languages. And again, this is what directly leads to the work of Lorenzo Valla and then Erasmus himself, which is what we'll have to pick up with next time. But extremely important. And so again, you look at these threads coming together, and when I say, I would have picked Wycliffe, but Wycliffe didn't live at the right time. You didn't have the Renaissance yet. You didn't have printing yet. You didn't have the fall of Constantinople yet. You didn't have, you were getting the rise of the middle class, and there were universities were being founded. Obviously, Wycliffe himself taught at a university, but not as many as you're going to need for the kind of Reformation that took place to take place. To me, it's maybe I'm just the only person on the planet. No, I know I'm not, but one of the few people on the planet that looks at this and goes, "Wow, that's incredible." It is so awesome to look back and to see the fingerprints of God in history, and to see what He was doing and the timing of things, and to recognize that many of these things at the time they were developing, no one could see how they were going to be tied together. Which makes me, think about today and go, what's going on around us is going to be so vitally important in the future. Well, very few of us. I certainly do not have the kind of insight to be able to identify those things. But there are every once in a while, each generation will have a person with an incredible amount of foresight along those lines.